spanning millennia into a history that just feels almost impossibly vast.
It really is.
It's, a story filled with these incredible cycles of unity and fragmentation, constant innovation, and yeah, massive upheaval too. It's truly a history that shaped a huge part of the world. Our mission really is to take this immense history from its earliest roots right up to the challenges China faces today and really unpack it for you. We're looking to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the dominant themes that kind of echo across centuries, and maybe some of those surprising details that bring it all to life. All right, let's start at the very beginning then. Prehistory, the earliest foundations leading up to what the sources call China's first historically verified state, the Shang Dynasty. So what are the sources telling us about how complex human activity first, popped up in this region?
Well, the archaeology, especially in recent decades, it's been pretty revolutionary, frankly. It pushes the timeline way back and challenges some of the older ideas.
Right.
Sources point to sites like Shiyu, which, get this, dates back to around 45,000 BCE.
Wow.
And this isn't just, basic human presence. It shows early Homo sapiens using advanced tools, and they were already part of these long-distance trade networks, maybe up to 1,000 kilometers.
45,000 BCE. That suggests a level of organization much, much earlier than I think most people realize.
Way earlier. And long before settled agriculture really took hold, we're seeing complex behavior, trade networks. It is pretty unexpected based on older models.
Okay, so moving forward from that really early period.
Right, so then the sources describe the emergence of these distinct Neolithic cultures, mainly clustering around the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. We're talking roughly 5,000 to 2,000 BCE. Cultures like the Yangshao, they're known for their painted pottery. Then there's the Longshan, famous for this really sophisticated black pottery. And down the Yangtze area, the Liangzhu culture, which stands out for its incredibly intricate jade working and very early rice cultivation.
And they were farming, building settlements.
Yeah, settled farming, proto-urban settlements. And the sources also mention early social stratification starting to appear even during this Neolithic period.
How do archaeologists, pick that out from the digs? What's the evidence look like?
Well, sites like Wangsuang, maybe around 3000 BCE, give us some pretty compelling clues. You see these really elaborate burials, right? Packed with grave goods like jade ornaments, sometimes loads of pig mandibles.
Pig mandibles, representing wealth.
Exactly. Signs of wealth, status. It shows clear social differences between people. And interestingly, some tombs even show signs of deliberate destruction, which kind of hints at political conflict or rivalry between these early centers of power. So what this whole archaeological picture suggests, according to the sources, isn't some single origin point for Chinese civilization. It's more like multiple distinct cultures developing complex societies pretty much simultaneously, interacting, maybe competing.
So not a simple straight line from one beginning, but maybe multiple centers popping up, sometimes clashing thousands of years before the famous dynasties. That feels like a really critical insight from these sources.
It really reshapes the narrative.
Okay, now the sources mention the semi-legendary Shi dynasty. Where does that fit into this picture? Is it real?
Ah, the Xia. Well, traditionally it's presented as China's first hereditary monarchy. It's linked to this figure, Yu the Great, who's famous for controlling the floods.
Flood control, that seems to come up a lot as a basis for legitimacy in the sources.
It does. A key task for rulers. Now, archaeologically, the Xia is often associated with the early Tang culture. We find, evidence of large palace foundations, bronze workshops, suggesting a pretty complex society right around that time. But the key point the sources emphasize is that we lack direct, contemporary written evidence, like inscriptions, that definitively says this is the Xia. So, while early II was clearly important, its status as the confirmed Xia dynasty is still debated by scholars. It's not like what comes next.
Which is the Shang, where we get that undeniable proof.
Exactly. The Shang dynasty, roughly 1600 to 1046 BCE. The sources are clear. This is China's first historically verified state. And the reason is simple. We have their writing.
The oracle bones.
The oracle bones, yeah. Turtle shells, animal bones. They use them for divination, asking questions about harvests, battles, royal births, you name it.
And they wrote on them.
They inscribe the questions and sometimes the answers right onto the bones using what we call oracle bone script. That's the oldest known form of Chinese writing.
Wow.
And these aren't just artifacts. They're invaluable historical documents. They give us concrete details about the Shang kings, their administration, their religious beliefs like ancestor worship, how their society was structured. It's like a direct window into their world.
That's incredible. And the sources also mention the Shang started absorbing their neighbors, forming a kind of loose polity. How did that work, and how did that early writing system play a role?
Right. The Shang, who were centered in the Yellow River Valley, gradually expanded their influence, bringing surrounding groups into their orbit.
Uh-huh.
And that Oracle bone script and the later evolution of Chinese characters was, well, hugely important for this.
How so?
Because Chinese characters mainly represent meaning, not just sounds, right? So people speaking different dialects, maybe even mutually unintelligible ones, could still understand the same written script.
Ah, I see. So it transcends spoken language barriers.
Exactly. It was this powerful tool for communication, for administration across a diverse population. It helped create a degree of political coherence very early on, kind of laying the groundwork for larger unified states later.
That makes perfect sense. A shared script is a powerful unifier. Okay, so the Shang rule for centuries, but eventually they fall. How does the Zhou dynasty take over, and what's the really big idea they introduce, according to the sources?
So the Zhou overthrow the Shang around 1046 BCE, and they go on to become the longest-lasting dynasty in Chinese history, technically reigning until 256 BCE, though their real power faded much earlier. Their huge contribution right at the start was introducing this absolutely pivotal concept, the Mandate of Heaven, or Ming.
Right, the idea that the ruler's power comes from, well, heaven, a sort of cosmic authority.
Yes, but it's a bit more complex than just divine right. The Zhou used it very cleverly to legitimize their overthrow of the Shang. They basically argued the Shang rulers became corrupt and ineffective, so heaven withdrew its mandate from them and gave it to us, the virtuous Zhou.
So it's conditional.
Yeah.
Based on performance, on virtue.
Precisely. The mandate wasn't permanent. It was based on the ruler's ability to govern justly and effectively. The sources often link this back to legendary sage kings, who supposedly chose successors based on merit, not just bloodline. If a ruler became corrupt, or if there were lots of natural disasters seen as bad omens, it could be interpreted as heaven withdrawing the mandate.
Which then justifies rebellion and dynastic change.
Exactly. It became this core principle of political legitimacy for over 2,000 years. It provided both a justification for ruling and a justification for overthrowing a ruler who failed. A really powerful, enduring idea that you see playing out again and again in the sources.
A tool for stability, but also for revolution. Fascinating. How did the Zhou actually rule in the beginning? Was it centralized like the later empires?
Initially, no. They set up a more decentralized system. It's often called infaufment, where the Zhou king granted large territories and authority to loyal followers and relatives, vassal lords, to govern on his behalf.
A bit like feudalism in Europe, maybe.
It has some parallels, yeah.
Yeah.
But over time, especially after their capital was forced eastward in 771 BCE, the central authority of the Zhou kings really weakened.
Okay.
This led to increasing fragmentation during what's called the Eastern Zhou era. This era itself is divided into two periods. The Spring and Autumn period, where there was still some deference to the Zhou king, but states acted more independently, engaging in complex diplomacy. And then the Warring States period, from about 475 to 221 BCE. By this point, the Zhou king was irrelevant, and maybe 7 major states were locked in this incredibly brutal existential struggle for supremacy, total war, innovative tactics, social upheaval.
A chaotic time.
Extremely chaotic. But interestingly, the sources highlight that this very period of intense stress and conflict, starting maybe around 800 BCE, but really accelerating in the Warring States, coincided with this incredible burst of philosophical creativity. Systematic reflective thinking really takes off.
Right, the 100 schools of thought.
Exactly that. Roughly the 6th down to the 3rd century BCE. Amidst all the political chaos and warfare, thinkers started proposing radically different solutions for how to restore order, how to govern effectively, how to live a good life.
So what were the main schools that emerged, according to the sources?
Well, the big ones that had lasting impact. First, Confucianism, founded by Confucius, of course. It focused heavily on ethics, proper social roles and hierarchies, ritual, filial piety, good governance through moral example, and the absolute importance of education. It basically provided the moral and social blueprint for the imperial state for the next 2 millennia.
Hugely influential. What else?
Then you have Taoism, often associated with figures like Laozi and Zhuangzi. It emphasized living in harmony with the Tao, the natural way of things. Often advocated for simplicity, spontaneity, and generally left government interference. Wu-wei effortless action.
Okay, sort of a counterpoint to Confucian structure.
In many ways, yes. Then there was legalism, which became really prominent during the Warring States with thinkers like Shang. Legalists had a pretty dim view of human nature. They argued the only way to create order was through strict, clear laws, harsh punishments and rewards, collective responsibility, and building a powerful centralized state that could enforce its will absolutely.
Very different approach. Pragmatic, but maybe harsh.
Definitely pragmatic, focused entirely on state power. And you also had other schools like Mohism, which advocated for universal love, treating everyone equally, and meritocracy, choosing officials based on ability, not birth. So all these schools were offering competing answers to the crisis of their time, and their ideas really shaped Chinese political and social thought for centuries.
It's fascinating how such profound thinking came out of such a violent, fragmented period. Like the chaos forced a deep reevaluation. So after all that warring, who finally put China back together?
That takes us to a really pivotal and frankly pretty dramatic turning point, the Qin dynasty. Very short-lived, 221 to 206 BCE, but incredibly important.
The first unified empire.
Exactly. The first time what we think of as China was brought under a single imperial state, led by King Zhang of the state of Qin, who declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor.
The guy with terracotta army.
That's the one. And the Qin ruled with an iron fist.
Ah.
They drew heavily on that legalist philosophy we just talked about, especially promoted by the Chancellor Li Si. Their whole approach was about implementing strict, centralized control after centuries of division.
How did they achieve that?
Through ruthless efficiency, basically.
Yeah.
Strict laws, severe punishments for even minor infractions, collective responsibility for families and communities. The goal was to strengthen the state above all else and ensure absolute order and obedience.
And they standardized things, right? The sources mention that being crucial.
Absolutely fundamental. This is one of the Qin's most lasting legacies, according to the sources. They imposed uniform standards across the entire empire for the writing system orthography.
Making sure everyone wrote the same characters.
Yes. And also weights, measures, currency, even the axle widths for carts to fit the roads. And of course, a unified legal code.
Why was that so important?
Well, think about it. After centuries of different states doing things their own way, this standardization broke down those regional barriers. It made administration, communication, and trade vastly more efficient across this huge new territory. It really laid the groundwork for effective centralized control.
And they established the basic imperial structure.
They did. The Qin created the blueprint for the centralized bureaucratic monarchy, emperor at the top, ministries below, administration reaching down to the local level that would basically define imperial China for the next 2,000 years. They also undertook massive building projects, mobilizing huge amounts of labor, like connecting existing defensive walls to form early versions of the Great Wall.
So the Qin created the mold, forceful and short-lived, but it was the Han Dynasty that followed them who really made that imperial system stick, right?
It's exactly right. The Han Dynasty, which ruled for over 400 years, 206 BCE to 220 CE, with a brief interruption, really consolidated and, well, institutionalized the imperial order. They largely kept the Qin's centralized administrative structure.
But they weren't quite as harsh.
Generally, no. The key difference, highlighted in the sources, is that the Han formally adopted and promoted Confucianism as the official ideology of the state. Emperor Wu, in particular, heavily patronized Confucian scholars and established imperial universities to train officials in the Confucian classics.
So blending Qin structure with Confucian values.
Precisely. This provided a shared cultural and ethical framework for the ruling elite and helped legitimize the state in a way that pure legalism perhaps couldn't. It created a more enduring social and political order.
How did they manage the day-to-day administration of such a large empire?
They refined the bureaucratic systems and legal traditions inherited from the Qin. A really major development over time was the imperial examination system.
Testing people to become officials.
Sort of, yes. It evolved over centuries, but the Han laid foundations. It aimed to select officials based, at least partly, on merit, their knowledge of Confucian texts and administrative principles rather than just birth or connections.
Did it work? Was it truly meritocratic?
Well, the sources suggest it wasn't perfect. Upper-class families definitely still had big advantages in terms of education and access. But it did create a pathway for talented individuals from less prominent backgrounds to rise. It fostered this culture of valuing education, the ideal of studying for 10 years to become an official.
Right.
And it helped create a class of scholar officials loyal to the imperial system itself, which contributed to its longevity and offered a degree of social mobility. They also moved further away from the old Zhou enfeoffment idea, relying more on a system of prefectures and counties directly administered by centrally appointed officials.
What other significant things happened during the Han, according to the sources?
Well, technology was booming. The sources often highlight Kailan's invention, or at least refinement, of papermaking during the Eastern Han, game-changing for record-keeping and communication.
Definitely.
And figures like Zhang made important contributions to science and astronomy. Geographically, the Han Empire expanded significantly. And crucially, they established and secured the trade routes that became known as the Silk Road.
Ah, the connection to the West.
Exactly. This wasn't just about trading silk for horses or glass. It facilitated this incredible flow of goods, ideas, technologies, and cultures between China, Central Asia, India, Persia, even the Roman world.
So China wasn't isolated at all back then.
Not during the Han, no. They were actively engaged. And this interaction brought new influences into China, too. The most significant, arguably, was Buddhism, which started trickling in via the Silk Road around the 1st century CE. It would have a profound impact later on.
So the Han really built a lasting imperial structure, integrated Confucianism, fostered innovation, and engaged with the wider world. But like all dynasties, their unity eventually ended.
That's the cycle, isn't it? After the Han collapsed in 220 AD, China entered another long period of disunity that lasted nearly 4 centuries, until 589.
Wow, 4 centuries.
Yeah, it's a complex era. We divide it into phases like the Three Kingdoms period, famous from literature and games.
Right, Cao, Liu Bei.
Those guys. Then the 16 Kingdoms and the Northern and Southern Dynasties. Basically, central authority vanished, the empire fragmented, and powerful regional families, these great families controlling vast estates and local influence, really rose to prominence.
Politically chaotic, but what about culture during this time? Did everything just stop?
Not at all. It's kind of a paradox. Despite the political fragmentation and warfare, this period saw significant cultural developments, according to the sources. Buddhism, which had arrived earlier, really took root and spread widely, becoming deeply interwoven with Chinese culture, art, and philosophy. And other arts flourished too. Calligraphy reached new heights, painting developed, historiography continued, and new forms of storytelling emerged. So even when the state was fractured, Chinese culture proved incredibly resilient and adaptive, absorbing new influences like Buddhism and continuing to evolve.
So how did China eventually get reunified after such a long stretch of division?
That reunification came under the Sui dynasty. It was actually a relatively short-lived dynasty, only from 581 to 618, but it played a crucial role. Emperor Wen of Sui managed to conquer the remaining rival states and bring China back under single rule.
What were their main contributions, according to the sources?
The Sui are noted for some important administrative innovations. They created the system of 3 departments and 6 ministries, which aimed to divide executive power and create more checks and balances within the central government. They also improved and further standardized the imperial examination system started under the Han.
Building on earlier foundations.
Exactly. And perhaps most famously, they undertook massive construction projects, most notably starting the massive expansion of the Grand Canal.
The canal linking North and South China.
Yes, connecting the Yellow River and the Yangtze River systems. This was absolutely vital for transporting grain from the fertile south to the northern capitals and armies. It had immense long-term economic and strategic significance, even though the immense costs and forced labor contributed to the Sui's quick downfall.
So the Sioux reunified China, laid some important groundwork, but didn't last long. They paved the way for
another great flowering, the Tang Dynasty. 618 to 907. The sources consistently paint the Tang as a real golden age, an era of incredible flourishing across the board: science, technology, art, and especially poetry. Think Li Bai, Du Fu.
Some of the most famous Chinese poets.
Absolutely. And the Tang was remarkably cosmopolitan and outward-looking. Chang'an, the capital, was a huge, vibrant city, maybe the largest in the world, filled with merchants, monks, and travelers from all over Asia and beyond. Foreign religions like Nestorian Christianity and Manichaeism were tolerated alongside Buddhism, which reached a peak of influence.
So very open and internationally connected.
Very much so, for much of its duration. The economy boomed, Chinese political and military influence stretched deep into Central Asia again, and the Silk Road was bustling. It was an era of great confidence and cultural achievement.
Sounds idyllic, but empires rarely stay that way. Did the Tang face challenges?
Oh, definitely. Internal power struggles were always a factor. But the major blow came in the mid-8th century with the devastating Anlushan rebellion. It was a massive upheaval led by a powerful general, and although the Tang survived, it was severely weakened. It lost control over outer regions, central authority declined, and it never fully recovered its former glory.
And after the Tang finally collapsed?
Another period of fragmentation. the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms period, from 907 to 960, a relatively short but chaotic interlude before unity was restored again.
This cycle really is relentless. Unity, disunity, unity. So who brought things back together this time?
That would be the Song dynasty, ruling from 960 to 1279. The Song managed to reunify most of China proper, although they constantly faced pressure from powerful nomadic empires to their north, like the Liao and later the Jin.
What are the Song known for, according to the sources? Militarily weak, maybe, but strong in other areas.
That's often the assessment, yeah.
Yeah.
Militarily, they struggled, but economically and culturally, the Song era was incredibly dynamic. The sources describe what some historians call a commercial revolution.
A commercial revolution. What did that involve?
Well, the economy became much more monetized. There was a huge growth in commerce, both internal and maritime trade. Cities swelled. Kaifeng and later Hangzhou were enormous, bustling urban centers with sophisticated markets, merchant guilds, restaurants, entertainment districts. Some of the most advanced cities in the world at the time.
Yeah. And technology.
Huge innovations. The Song military made practical use of gunpowder in weapons like rockets and primitive cannons. They established the world's first permanent standing navy. They pioneered the use of paper money jiaozi to facilitate trade. Printing technology, using movable type, became widespread, leading to a surge in literacy and book production. Agriculture also saw advances like new rice strains enabling double cropping. There was significant proto-industrial production, especially in iron.
Wow. So incredibly advanced economically and technologically, maybe even more so than the Tang in some ways.
Arguably, yes, in terms of economic complexity and technological application. But as you said, they were often on the defensive militarily. They eventually lost control of northern China to the Jin dynasty, and finally the entire dynasty was conquered by the Mongols.
Right, leading to the Yuan dynasty.
Exactly. The Yuan dynasty, 1271 to 1368. Founded by Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. This was part of the vast Mongol Empire, which stretched across Eurasia. It's the second time a conquest dynasty ruled all of China proper.
What was distinctive about Yuan rule?
Well, the sheer scale of the Mongol Empire led to a period known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. For a time, trade and communication across Eurasia were safer and easier than ever before, because the entire Silk Road was basically under the control of one power.
So, more connections again?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Marco Polo's famous journey happened during this time. Culturally, there was exchange across the empire. Administratively, the Yuan largely kept the existing Chinese bureaucratic structures in place, but they imposed a clear ethnic hierarchy with Mongols at the top, followed by other non-Han groups, then Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese at the bottom. This caused considerable resentment.
And the Yuan didn't last as long as some other dynasties.
No, less than a century ruling all of China. Internal divisions within the Mongol elite, natural disasters, disease, and widespread peasant uprisings, particularly the Red Turban Rebellion, led to their overthrow.
Which brings us to the Ming dynasty.
The Ming, 1368 to 1644. They restored Han Chinese rule after driving out the Mongols. The Ming emperors, particularly the founder Hongwu and later Yongle, really focused on consolidating central power, maybe even more so than previous dynasties.
How did they do that?
Hongwu famously abolished the position of chancellor, or prime minister, taking direct control over the central government ministries. They also established a very sophisticated and often feared secret police and censorate system to monitor officials and suppress dissent.
Sounds pretty authoritarian.
It certainly had that potential, but the Ming is also famous for other things. Culturally vibrant, porcelain, novels, and those incredible maritime expeditions early on.
Right. Zhang,
Yeah.
usages.
Exactly. Under the Yongle Emperor in the early 15th century, these massive fleets sailed all the way to the Indian Ocean, East Africa, the Persian Gulf. They weren't voyages of conquest or colonization, more about projecting Ming power, establishing tributary relationships, and maybe exploring trade opportunities. The scale was just immense.
But then they stopped. Why?
That's a big historical debate. After Yongle died, the court politics shifted. Confucian officials were often skeptical of these expensive voyages and overseas entanglements. Concerns about northern border defense against the Mongols also drew resources away. So the Ming largely turned inward, implementing strict maritime prohibitions, the Hijin laws, trying to restrict private sea trade and contact.
Did that work?
Not entirely. It actually contributed to widespread smuggling and piracy along the coast, involving both Japanese and Chinese figures, the so-called wokou pirates, which became a major headache for the Ming government later on. They also faced other challenges, like major fiscal problems and devastating natural disasters. The sources mention the deadliest earthquake in recorded history occurred during the Jiajing Emperor's reign in the 16th century.
And eventually, the Ming fell too.
Yes, a combination of internal rebellions, particularly the one led by Li Zicheng, who briefly took Beijing, an invasion from the northeast by the Manchus.
The Manchus, where did they come from?
They were descendants of the Jurchens who had founded the Jin dynasty centuries earlier, based in Manchuria, outside the Great Wall. Under capable leaders like Nurhaci and later Hongkaiji, they organized themselves using the eight-banner system, a military and social structure, and grew increasingly powerful, challenging the weakened Ming.
And they established the last imperial dynasty.
They did. They took Beijing in 1644 and established the Qing dynasty, which ruled China until 1912.
Another conquest dynasty, like the Yuan.
Yes, the second conquest dynasty to rule all of China proper. And the Qing significantly expanded the empire's territory, roughly doubling what the Ming had controlled. They incorporated vast regions like Tibet, Xinjiang, modern western China, Mongolia, and eventually Taiwan into the empire.
How did they manage such a huge, diverse empire as non-Han rulers?
It was complex. The sources show they were quite adept at adopting and utilizing existing Ming administrative systems for ruling China proper, presenting themselves as legitimate Confucian rulers. But they also maintained distinct Manchu institutions, like the Eight Banners, and employed different methods for governing non-Han areas in Inner Asia, often drawing on local traditions or Mongol precedents. It was a multifaceted approach.
So combining Chinese and Inner Asian traditions.
Exactly. They strengthened authoritarian control compared to the Ming in some ways, things like literary inquisitions to suppress perceived anti-Manchu sentiment and a greater emphasis on military structures. The transition from Ming to Qing was incredibly violent and costly in human lives, but once consolidated, the Qing presided over a long period of relative peace and prosperity, especially during the 18th century under emperors like Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong. This era saw population growth and another flourishing of arts and culture.
But that stability didn't last into the 19th century. That's when things start to go downhill, leading to the century of humiliation narrative the sources mention.
Yes, the 19th century was a period of profound crisis for the Qing and for China. While China avoided outright colonization like India or much of Southeast Asia, it faced relentless pressure and military defeats at the hands of Western powers and later Japan. The Opium Wars are key here.
The wars with Britain and later France. What triggered the first one?
The immediate trigger, according to the sources, was the Qing government's attempt to actually enforce its ban on the opium trade, which was being pushed heavily by British merchants. Commissioner Lin Zexu famously confiscated and destroyed huge stocks of British opium in Canton.
And Britain reacted militarily.
They did. Using their superior naval technology, they defeated the Qing forces. The result was the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, the first of many unequal treaties.
Unequal how? What were the consequences?
They were deeply damaging to China's sovereignty. China was forced to cede Hong Kong Island to Britain, pay a huge indemnity, open up several treaty ports to foreign trade and residence where foreigners enjoyed extraterritoriality, meaning they weren't subject to Chinese law, and grant Britain control over tariffs on imported goods. Later wars and treaties forced even more concessions, legalized the opium trade, allowed missionaries deep into the interior, and carved out spheres of influence for various powers.
A massive blow to Qing authority and finances.
Huge. It weakened the dynasty immeasurably, led to ongoing fiscal crises because of the indemnities, and fundamentally challenged the traditional Confucian worldview and the competence of the ruling elite in the eyes of many Chinese.
And this external pressure coincided with massive internal problems too, right?
Absolutely. The foreign intrusions exacerbated existing social and economic tensions, leading to enormous internal rebellions. The Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864 was the biggest. Led by Hong Xiuquan, who believed he was Jesus' younger brother, it aimed to overthrow the king and establish a heavenly kingdom. It had a unique ideology blending Christian and indigenous elements. The scale of violence was horrific. The sources estimate maybe 20 million people died. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history.
20 million. Staggering. And there were others.
Yes, later in the century, you had things like the Ming Rebellion in the north, various Muslim uprisings in the northwest and southwest, and then, at the very end of the century, the Boxer Rebellion from 1899 to 1901.
What was the Boxer Rebellion about?
It was primarily an anti-foreign, anti-Christian uprising by secret societies, fueled by drought, economic hardship, and resentment against foreign influence and missionary activities. It was initially opposed, but then tacitly supported by some conservative elements at the Qing court. The Boxers attacked foreigners and Chinese Christians, besieging the foreign legations in Beijing.
How did that end?
badly for China. An international force, the Eight-Nation Alliance, intervened, defeated the Boxers and Qing troops, occupied Beijing, and imposed yet another humiliating peace settlement with a massive indemnity. It further demonstrated the king's impotence.
Amidst all this, were there any attempts by the king themselves to reform or modernize?
Yes, there were efforts. The sources mention the self-strengthening movement, roughly from the 1860s to the 1890s. This was an attempt by some reform-minded officials to adopt Western military technology, building arsenals, shipyards, learning about Western science, basically. Chinese learning for the essence, Western learning for practical use.
Did it work?
Only up to a point. It achieved some things, modernizing parts of the military and industry, but it was ultimately hampered by conservative resistance within the government, lack of central coordination, corruption, and a reluctance to undertake deeper institutional or political reforms that might challenge the traditional Confucian system or Manchu power. The defeat by Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95, really exposed the limitations of this approach.
So, repeated defeats, internal rebellions, failed reforms, it all led towards the end of the dynasty.
It created fertile ground for more radical change. The final blow came with the 1911 Xinhai Revolution. A series of uprisings across the country led to the abdication of the last king-emperor, Pui, in early 1912. Over 2,000 years of imperial rule came to an end.
And the Republic of China was established?
Yes, in 1912. This was meant to be a fundamental shift from empire to republic, with a parliament elected by provincial delegates. Sun Yat-sen, a key revolutionary leader often called the father of modern China, became the first provisional president.
But he didn't stay in power long.
No. To avoid further conflict and unify the country, Sun quickly ceded the presidency to Yuan Shikai, the powerful general who controlled the strongest modernized army, the Beiyang army, and had persuaded the king-emperor to abdicate.
So hopes for a stable republic, did they materialize? The sources seem to paint a picture of continued instability.
Extremely unstable, unfortunately. Yuan Shikai wasn't really a Republican at heart. He quickly consolidated power using his military strength, sidelined the parliament, outlawed Sun Yat-sen's political party, the Kuomintang, KMT, and even tried to declare himself emperor in late 1915.
It didn't go over well, I imagine.
It provoked widespread opposition, and he died shortly after in 1916. But his death didn't bring stability. Instead, it fractured the country, ushering in the warlord era.
Warlord era, what was that like?
From 1916 up to about 1927 or 1928, central authority completely collapsed. China was divided among numerous regional military commanders, warlords, who ruled their territories like personal fiefdoms, fought constantly amongst themselves, levied taxes, and often ignored the nominal republican government in Beijing. It was a period of immense suffering and chaos for ordinary people.
Another round of disunity. How did the KMT, Sun Yat-sen's party, try to deal with this?
Sun Yat-sen didn't give up. He returned to China and tried to establish rival governments in the south, based in Guangzhou. He reorganized the KMT in 1919 and, crucially, sought help to build a loyal party army capable of defeating the warlords and reunifying China.
Where did he get help?
From the Soviet Union. Soviet advisors arrived in the early 1920s, providing funding, weapons, and organizational models. They helped establish the Whampoa Military Academy near Guangzhou in 1924 to train officers for the new National Revolutionary Army, NRA. A key aspect the sources highlight is that the NRA was intended to be under the KMT's political control, unlike the personal armies of the warlords.
And who led this new army?
The first commandant of Whampoa was Chiang Kai-shek. After Sun Yat-sen died relatively young in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek gradually consolidated his leadership over both the KMT and the NRA.
And he launched the campaign against the warlords.
Yes, the Northern Expedition, from 1926 to 1928. The NRA marched north from Guangzhou, defeating or co-opting various warlord factions. While it didn't completely eliminate warlord power, many were incorporated into the NRA with their troops. It succeeded in nominally unifying much of China under the KMT government, which established its new capital in Nanjing. The NRA was recognized, at least on paper, as China's national army.
So this marks the beginning of the Nanjing decade.
Right, roughly 1927 to 1937. This was the period when Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT government were based in Nanjing and attempted the challenging task of nation-building. They focused on strengthening government institutions, developing the economy, modernizing the legal system, and trying to assert central control.
What was their governing structure like?
They reorganized the government, based partly on Sun Yat-sen's ideas, creating 5 branches, or Yuan, executive, legislative, judicial, control, and examination, and promulgated a provisional constitution. The sources note that Shang himself was quite influenced by contemporary European fascist movements in his emphasis on party discipline, state power, and national unity during this period.
Were there efforts during this decade to develop the military and infrastructure despite the ongoing challenges?
Yes, there were. The Republic of China Air Force was formally established in 1929 and began to grow, though it was still small when war broke out. Chiang also had plans for a modern navy, but much of the existing fleet was destroyed early in the war with Japan in 1937. Militarily, perhaps the most significant development was that some elite NRA divisions received training and equipment from German military advisors in the 1930s.
And infrastructure.
Despite the instability and ongoing conflicts, including campaigns against the communists, infrastructure did see some improvement. The sources show the railroad network continued to expand between 1912 and the start of the full-scale war in 1937, and the highway network also grew significantly. Some regional leaders, even warlords, actually invested quite heavily in local projects like railways or waterway navigation companies.
But this period of relative stability and state building was cut short.
Dramatically cut short by Japan's full-scale invasion in 1937, marking the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, which would last until 1945. This was a devastating conflict for China, causing immense loss of life, destruction, and displacing millions of people. It became part of World War II.
And right after the defeat of Japan in 1945, the internal conflict flared up again.
Almost immediately. The Chinese Civil War between Chiang Kai-shek's KMT nationalists and the Communist Party of China, CCP, led by Mao Zedong, resumed with full force. It had been simmering even during the war against Japan, despite a nominal united front.
The CCP had been founded back in 1921. How had they grown strong enough to challenge the KMT?
They had a long, difficult struggle, including the famous Long March in the mid-1930s. But they were effective at organizing in rural areas, often gaining support from peasants through promises of land reform, and by portraying themselves as more dedicated anti-Japanese fighters than the KMT during the war. The sources suggest the war against Japan actually strengthened the CCP. In many ways, it allowed them to expand their base areas, gain military experience, hone their guerrilla tactics, and build popular support, often in areas where KMT control was weak or had collapsed.
So by 1945, they were in a much better position.
Definitely better positioned relative to the KMT, which had borne the brunt of the conventional fighting against Japan and was weakened, exhausted, and facing major economic problems like hyperinflation.
What factors do the sources generally point to for the eventual communist victory in 1949?
It's complex, of course, but the sources usually highlight several key factors. On the communist side, strong military leadership and strategy under Mao Zedong and commanders like Zhou and Lin Biao, widespread popular support, particularly among the vast peasantry mobilized by land reform promises, effective propaganda and discipline within the party and the People's Liberation Army, PLA.
And on the KMT side, weaknesses.
Significant weaknesses, according to most accounts. Rampant corruption within the KMT government and army alienated many, including the urban middle class. Poor military morale and leadership in some KMT units. Crucially, the KMT government failed to control the post-war economy, leading to devastating hyperinflation that wiped out savings and turned many city dwellers against them.
So a combination of CCP strengths and KMT weaknesses led to the outcome.
That's the general consensus in the sources. The PLA won decisive victories in major campaigns in 1948 and 1949, and the KMT forces disintegrated or defected. Chiang Kai-shek and the ROC government retreated to Taiwan.
And in October 1949, Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China, PRC.
Exactly. Standing atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing. This marked a truly radical break with the past, establishing a completely new political and social system based on Marxist-Leninist ideology, with the Communist Party holding absolute, unchallenged power through a Leninist party-state structure.
Mao's era, from 1949 until his death in 1976, saw some enormous social experiments and campaigns. What were the key ones highlighted in the sources?
Two stand out for their massive impact, both intended and unintended. First, the Great Leap Forward, from 1958 to 1962.
What was the goal there?
It was this incredibly ambitious, ideologically driven campaign to rapidly transform China's economy from an agrarian one into a communist society through rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivization, setting up huge rural communes, backyard steel furnaces.
And the results?
Catastrophic. The sources are clear on this. Faulty agricultural policies based on pseudoscience, the diversion of labor to useless projects like the backyard furnaces, exaggerated reports of success, and the suppression of bad news led to a collapse in food production. The result was a massive famine, one of the worst in human history. Estimates vary, but tens of millions of people died of starvation and related diseases. It starkly highlights the dangers of centralized planning divorced from reality and driven purely by ideology.
A truly devastating outcome. And the other major campaign?
The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, launched by Mao in 1966 and lasting in various phases until his death in 1976.
What was the aim of the Cultural Revolution?
Ostensibly, it was to purge society of bourgeois elements, capitalist tendencies, and traditional ideas, and to rekindle revolutionary spirit, particularly among the youth, the Red Guards. Mao also used it to regain absolute authority after being somewhat sidelined following the failure of the Great Leap Forward, targeting perceived rivals within the party.
What was its impact?
Profoundly destructive and chaotic. It led to widespread political persecution, factional violence, the destruction of cultural heritage, the breakdown of education and institutions, and immense human suffering. Intellectuals, officials, and ordinary citizens were publicly denounced, humiliated, imprisoned, tortured, or killed. It plunged China into turmoil for a decade and left deep scars on society. The sources emphasize its deep impact on intellectual and cultural life, suppressing scholarship and traditional practices.
An incredibly turbulent period. What happened after Mao finally died in 1976?
His death was followed by a brief power struggle. The Gang of Four, including Mao's widow Qing, who had been prominent during the Cultural Revolution, were arrested. By 1978, Deng Xiaoping, a veteran revolutionary who had been purged twice during Mao's era, had emerged as the paramount leader, and he initiated a dramatic shift in policy.
This is the famous reform and opening up.
Exactly. Gage Kaifang. This marks another absolutely crucial turning point in modern Chinese history. Deng took a much more pragmatic approach than Mao.
Pragmatic how? What did the reforms involve?
Deng's genius, arguably, was in finding a way to introduce market mechanisms and open China to the outside world while maintaining the Communist Party's firm grip on political power. He decollectivized agriculture, allowing families to farm their own plots. He encouraged private enterprise in township and village enterprises. He established special economic zones, SEZs, along the coast, like Shenzhen, to attract foreign investment and technology. He gradually allowed market forces to play a greater role in setting prices and allocating resources.
And the results were dramatic, weren't they?
Unprecedented. China experienced decades of incredibly rapid economic growth, averaging around 10% per year for much of the period. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of absolute poverty. Massive industrialization occurred, transforming China into the workshop of the world. And there was huge urbanization. The sources note the urban population shot up from maybe 19% in 1980 to over 60% today, involving the largest internal migration in human history. It fundamentally reshaped China's economy and society and turned it into a global economic powerhouse.
But the political system remained under tight party control.
Absolutely. Deng insisted on upholding the four cardinal principles, which included the leadership of the CCP. The crushing of the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 brutally demonstrated the limits of political reform. The model was economic liberalization under strict one-party rule. The sources also mention that this reform era saw the emergence of scar literature as writers began to grapple with the traumas of the Maoist period.
How has China evolved since Deng, under his successors?
The path of economic reform and global integration generally continued under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, who succeeded Deng. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, further embedding it in the global economy. However, since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, the sources describe a significant shift towards greater centralization of authority and a reassertion of party control over many aspects of society.
How has Xi consolidated power?
Through several means. He's chaired numerous new party leading groups, centralizing decision-making around himself. He oversaw the abolition of presidential term limits in 2018, allowing him to potentially rule indefinitely, and he launched a massive anti-corruption campaign.
Has the anti-corruption campaign been effective?
It has certainly netted many high-ranking officials tigers, as well as lower-level flies. The sources acknowledge it tackled real corruption, which was a major public concern. However, analysts cited in the sources also point out that it conveniently served to remove potential political rivals and enforce party discipline, consolidating Xi's personal power significantly.
What about state control over society and expression under Xi?
The sources indicate a tightening of controls. There's stricter regulation of NGOs and civil society groups. Online censorship and surveillance, through the Great Firewall, have become more sophisticated and pervasive. Freedoms in Hong Kong have been dramatically curtailed following the 2019 protests, particularly with the imposition of the national security law in 2020. While pockets of activism still exist around labor rights, environmental issues, feminist causes, they face significant constraints and risks from the state security apparatus.
It really sounds like contemporary China is defined by some major contradictions.
That's a key theme emerging from the sources, yes. You have this unique, perhaps unprecedented combination of a highly authoritarian political system coexisting with a dynamic, albeit state-influenced, market economy. You see a revival of cultural traditionalism alongside cutting-edge technological development and futurism. And China is deeply integrated into the global system while also pursuing assertive nationalist goals. These tensions define the present era.
Okay, that brings us pretty much up to the present day chronologically.
Right.
Let's maybe step back now and look at some of those big cross-cutting themes that run through this whole vast history. Based on the sources, geography and environment seem like a good place to start.
Absolutely foundational. China's sheer size and geographical diversity has shaped everything. You've got the fertile eastern plains along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, the cradles of agriculture and civilization, then the deserts, steppes, and high mountains in the west and north, which acted as both barriers and zones of interaction with nomadic peoples.
And the rivers were key.
Absolutely critical, especially the Yellow River. But it's also prone to devastating floods, hence its nickname, China's Sorrow. Water management, flood control, irrigation has been a central concern for rulers throughout Chinese history. Success or failure in managing water was often seen as reflecting the ruler's legitimacy, a point the sources often make. And environmental challenges aren't new deforestation, soil erosion, desertification in the north. These are issues with deep historical roots alongside the constant need for effective water management.
Okay, how about society and culture? What are the enduring structures and key features?
Well, traditional Chinese society was deeply shaped by Confucian ideals. This meant a strong emphasis on hierarchy. Think of the traditional ranking, often simplified as scholars at the top, then farmers, artisans, and merchants at the bottom. Patriarchal family structures were the norm, with emphasis on filial piety and ancestor veneration. Though it's important to note, the sources also highlight exceptional women who challenged norms, like the scholar Ban Zhao or even Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman to rule China as emperor in her own right.
What about social groups beyond the family?
Kinship organizations, lineages, and clans were incredibly important, especially in rural areas, providing social support, organizing local affairs, and sometimes wielding considerable power. Demographically, China has seen massive population booms, especially under the Qing, but also devastating population losses from wars and famines, like the Great Leap Forward. The recent incredibly rapid urbanization is drastically changing social structures, more nuclear families, challenges related to the hukou household registration system, which ties access to services to one's official place of residence, creating issues for migrant workers. And of course, the legacy of the former one-child policy means China now faces a rapidly aging population and a shrinking workforce.
And China isn't monolithic ethnically, is it?
Not at all. While the Han Chinese constitute the vast majority, China is officially recognized as a multi-ethnic state with 55 minority groups. Some groups, like the Tibetans and Uyghurs in Xinjiang, have distinct cultures, languages, and histories, leading to complex relationships with the central state. Contemporary policies regarding these groups are a major point of debate highlighted in the sources, often framed as balancing minority autonomy versus promoting national unity and sinicization, with particularly intense controversy surrounding current policies in Xinjiang.
Let's touch on the cultural and intellectual heritage again. What stands out across the millennia?
It's incredibly rich and deep. You have the foundational philosophies, Confucianism, Taoism, later Buddhism arriving and becoming deeply ingrained. These often coexisted, blending with folk religions and ancestor worship. Islam and Christianity also have long histories in China, though their practice today is subject to state oversight and control.
And intellectual tradition.
From the 100 schools of thought in the Warring States period, through the development of Neo-Confucianism in the Song and Ming dynasties, to modern intellectual currents grappling with tradition and modernity. The artistic and literary achievements are immense. Tang poetry, song landscape painting, classic novels like Dream of the Red Chamber or Journey to the West, Peking opera, calligraphy, ceramics. The list is endless.
Material culture, too.
Definitely. Iconic architectural achievements like the Great Wall System, the Forbidden City, the Temple of Heaven, the Terracotta Army. Language itself is a key cultural element, with a long evolution of characters and the standardization of Mandarin as the official spoken language, alongside the introduction of simplified characters in the PRC. And of course, China's historical contributions to science and technology, the famous four great inventions, papermaking, printing, gunpowder, the compass, but also significant advances in astronomy, medicine, engineering. Today, there's massive investment in modern R&D in fields like AI, biotech, and space exploration. While the Cultural Revolution sought to destroy much traditional culture, the post-Mao era has seen a significant revival and official promotion of certain aspects of Chinese heritage. Okay, let's shift to military and security matters.
Yeah.
How has warfare and strategic thinking evolved? It's a constant thread. You see the evolution from Zhou Dynasty chariot warfare to the massive infantry armies and sophisticated crossbow technology of the Warring States period, which is when Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War, a classic still studied globally.
How did Imperial China defend itself?
Imperial defense was a huge undertaking. Building and maintaining fortifications like the Great Wall system was one aspect. Establishing military garrisons and agricultural colonies, Tunshin on the frontiers, was another. There were ongoing debates throughout history about the best strategy defensive walls versus offensive campaigns out into the steppe to deal with nomadic threats. Military organization also changed constantly from the Han's professional standing armies to the Tang's fuming militia system, the Ming's hereditary military households, and the Qing's dual system of Manchu banners and the Han Chinese Green Standard Army.
Technology played a role too.
Big time. The adoption of iron weapons, the development and use of gunpowder initially for fireworks, then increasingly in warfare from the Song Dynasty onwards naval power, cavalry tactics adapted from nomads. Today, the focus is on high-tech warfare, cyber capabilities, anti-accessory denial systems. Strategic thought continues to draw on ancient classics, but also incorporates modern concepts, like Mao's People's War and the current doctrine of active defense.
And the modern military?
The People's Liberation Army, PLA, has undergone huge modernization and restructuring, especially since 2015, aiming to become a world-class fighting force. There's heavy investment in advanced technologies, AI, hypersonic missiles, space capabilities, and a rapidly expanding blue water navy. China is also increasingly active in international security roles like UN peacekeeping and regional initiatives like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but it also faces complex security challenges. The issue of Taiwan, territorial disputes in the South China Sea, border tensions with India, managing cybersecurity threats.
That leads naturally into international relations. How has China viewed its place in the world over time?
Historically, the dominant view, as reflected in the sources, was often Sino-centric China as the Middle Kingdom, the civilized center of the world, with surrounding states expected to acknowledge its superiority through tributary relationships. Think of historical ties with Korea, Vietnam, the Ryukyu Kingdom.
But the 19th century shattered that view.
Completely. The forced integration into the Western-dominated international system through the unequal treaties during the Century of Humiliation was a profound trauma. It led to a loss of sovereignty and a long struggle to regain national strength and international respect.
How did things change after the PRC was founded in 1949?
There were oscillations. Initially, alignment with the Soviet Union in the early Cold War, then a period of non-alignment and promoting revolution. The big shift came with a rapprochement with the U.S., starting with Nixon's visit in 1972, which marked China's reintegration into the mainstream international system.
And the reform era.
That saw China fully embrace globalization, joining international institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and finally the WTO in 2001. This economic integration fueled its rise. Today, China asserts itself as a major global power, playing key roles in the UN Security Council, BRICS, and other forums. The Belt and Road Initiative represents a massive effort to expand its economic and political influence across Eurasia and Africa.
But this rise also creates friction.
Definitely. Growing strategic competition with the United States is probably the defining feature of international relations today. Tensions remain high over trade, technology, human rights, and regional security issues like the South China Sea and Taiwan. Relations with neighbors like Japan, India, Australia, and Southeast Asian nations are complex, balancing economic interdependence with strategic rivalries and historical mistrust. China's official foreign policy doctrine emphasizes non-interference, but its growing power inevitably leads to greater influence and impact, sometimes controversially. And the sources stress how historical memory, both the pride in past glories and the deep-seated grievance over the century of humiliation, continues to shape China's nationalism and its approach to the world today.
So, bringing all these historical threads and contemporary developments together, what would you say are the key modern challenges China is grappling with right now, according to the sources we've looked at?
It's a long list, really. Internally, navigating the inherent tensions of authoritarian governance alongside a complex market economy is central. Human rights concerns, particularly regarding the treatment of Uyghurs and other minorities in Xinjiang, as well as the suppression of dissent more broadly, draw significant international criticism. Domestically, tackling inequality, the huge gap between rich and poor, and between coastal cities and the rural interior remains a major challenge for social stability. Environmental degradation, air and water pollution, carbon emissions, resource scarcity is an urgent crisis. Demographically, the rapidly aging population and shrinking workforce pose long-term economic challenges. The economy itself faces headwinds, managing high levels of debt, transitioning from an investment-led model to one driven by consumption and innovation, dealing with U.S. trade pressure and tech restrictions, and externally, managing the strategic competition with the U.S., resolving territorial disputes peacefully, particularly Taiwan, and navigating complex regional relationships are all top priorities.
Finally, let's briefly touch on how this history itself is studied and interpreted, the historiography. The sources themselves must reflect different perspectives.
Absolutely. The way Chinese history has been written and understood has changed dramatically over time. You have the long tradition of official dynastic histories, starting with Sima in the Han Dynasty. These were compiled by scholar officials, often aiming to provide moral lessons for rulers and legitimize the current dynasty by showing how the previous one lost the mandate of heaven.
How did things change in the 20th century?
After 1949, under the PRC, Marxist historical materialism became the dominant framework. History was interpreted primarily through the lens of class struggle, peasant rebellions, and the supposed inevitable progression towards socialism and communism.
And more recently.
Scholarship, both inside and outside China, has become much more diverse. You have approaches like the New Qing history, which emphasizes the Manchu and Inner Asian aspects of the Qing Empire. There's global history, placing China in wider comparative contexts. Interdisciplinary methods are common, drawing on archaeology, anthropology, environmental science. There's more focus on social history, history from below, trying to understand the lives of ordinary people, women, marginalized groups. And there's ongoing discussion about using methodologies rooted in China's own long historiographical tradition alongside Western approaches.
And there are still major debates among historians.
Oh, constantly. The historicity of the Xia dynasty, as we discussed, is one. The relative importance of the mandate of heaven versus material factors like climate change, economic crisis, peasant unrest in explaining dynastic cycles is another enduring debate. Mao Zedong's legacy is intensely contested, balancing the unification of China and social reforms against the immense human costs of his campaigns like the Great Leap Forward famine and the Cultural Revolution. Evaluating the post-1978 reforms involves weighing the incredible economic growth and poverty reduction against rising inequality, environmental damage, and continued political repression. And, as mentioned, PRC policies towards ethnic minorities, especially in Xinjiang and Tibet, are subject to fierce debate and widely divergent interpretations based on different sources and perspectives.
How is history used in China today? Does the past still actively shape the present?
Very actively. The sources show that history is frequently invoked by the party state for political purposes. Nationalist narratives emphasizing China's long civilization, past glories, and the suffering during the century of humiliation are used to bolster legitimacy, promote national unity, and justify contemporary policies aimed at achieving the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Historical arguments are also used to support territorial claims, for instance in the South China Sea or regarding Taiwan. Certain sensitive historical events, like the Cultural Revolution or the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown, remain subject to strict official narratives and censorship, limiting open discussion within mainland China.
And the sources historians use are incredibly varied.
Immensely. From archaeological finds like oracle bones, bronzes, the terracotta army, and manuscripts from Dunhuang to classical texts, official dynastic histories, local gazetteers, philosophical works, poetry, novels, personal diaries, inscriptions, and for more recent history, archives, newspapers, oral histories, government documents, statistical data. Plus, new methods using things like paleoenvironmental data to understand past climate changes. It's a vast and complex field, constantly evolving as new evidence emerges and new questions are asked. And there are still gaps, particularly regarding early periods or the perspectives of non-elites and minority groups.
Wow, that is just an immense sweep of history, covering millennia, filled with these recurring cycles, incredible innovations, and just profound transformations.
It truly is. You see this history shaped so deeply by its geography, by these enduring philosophical traditions we talked about, by periods of intense conflict and fragmentation, but also by this remarkable capacity for adaptation and continuity. There's this constant quest for unity, for a stable, centralized state running alongside moments of radical political, social, and economic change, especially in the last century or so.
And it feels like understanding this incredibly deep history with all its layers, its different interpretations, its contested moments, and those recurring patterns. It really is crucial for making sense of China today, isn't it?
I think that's absolutely right. The past has never really passed, especially in a place with such a long and well-documented history.